Is hair metal a degrading term? According to Eddie Trunk, it is. In this video, I'm going to show you a clip from one of my interviews with Eddie Trunk, where he discusses why he does not like the term hair metal.
Why do you think the 80s got looked over like that to a large extent?
Because I think there's still a stigma against it. I still think there's a bias against it. I still think that the backlash to it was so unbelievably severe by the media at the time that there's still a little sort of like, it's still looked at as sort of like not as legitimate, which I don't agree with at all, but I think it's just looked at as like, it's why I personally hate the term hairband and hair metal. And I've talked about this a lot. That is a term that was put out in the 90s to marginalize these bands as being style over substance. In recent years, it's become like a badge of honor, and some of the fans even use the term because they think it's like, it just defines their music and they're proud of it. I always warn against it. I'm like, you're playing right into the narrative of why that stuff doesn't hold a seat at the table the way it should, because you're perpetuating the stereotype that it was all about hairspray and not about the quality of the music. So I think as long as people continue to marginalize it and call it hair metal, and people continue to just talk about the image versus what the records sounded like and the quality of the music, and there was some great music there, it's always going to be put into the sort of this box. And much of it is relegated to weekend specialty shows or, special, the hairspray hour or whatever, these radio stations have. And it's ridiculous because it should sit right next to anything from the 70s or the 90s. But there's still a stigma against it. There really is in a lot of circles. I think Guns N' Roses are sort of looked at as the band that gave the 80s the injection of life and in some degree an enema, and changed the tide a little bit, got a little more street, got a little more raw, got a little more real, if that's what you want to call it. I think Nirvana is looked at as the band that flushed that scene and was so immediately impactful that it just changed the tide for a decade. And I think when you have that much of an impact, that's just going to resonate for a really long period of time. And, the quality of the music, whether you like it or not is subjective, but for that genre of music, it's still really, really good. And it just made such a mark on people that it's just resonated like this. The one thing that I think is tremendously unfair, now that things have leveled off just a little bit, like in other words, now the 80s stuff has finally come around where it has a fighting chance. Those bands can at least go out and play clubs, most of them. Here in America, we just, because I'm assuming you're in Canada, right? Yeah. So here in America, we just got a TV commercial for an insurance company we have here called Geico, and they're putting Ratt Round and Round. The band is actually playing the song in their video. Previous to that, they used Europe, The Final Countdown. You're starting to see a lot of that 80s stuff become what it should be, a generation's classic rock. I'm 55. That's essentially my classic rock. So people are starting to realize that, and it's getting a seat at the table. But I think what's really unfair is classic rock radio in America, and I know you've done a film on this, what is classic rock? They, for whatever reason, for the most part, continue to ignore that stuff. And they went 70s and jumped right to 90s. So you're getting a lot of Nirvana and Soundgarden and Pearl Jam in the mix now at classic rock, but you're getting very little of Ratt, Slaughter, Winger, Warrant, White Lion, or Cinderella. You're getting maybe a dabble of that, but really not all that much.
As the legend goes, once we got into the early 90s with Nirvana and grunge, all of a sudden there was like an overnight switch from hard rock, glam metal over to grunge. As someone who worked in the business, did you feel that switch?
Calling it a switch is pretty much exactly what you could say. It was overnight. It was abrupt. It was brutal. It was unforgiving, and it was instantaneous. So yes, it was as rough and brutal and abrupt as you could possibly ever paint it. I've worked in radio my whole life. I worked in radio during that decade as well. I literally had a program director come in one day when I'm playing whatever I was playing, whether it had been, mixing in Warrant with Led Zeppelin or mixing in Cinderella with Aerosmith, back to back, no problem. This is what we're doing. To one day just coming in and pulling those CDs out of the wall, throwing them in a cardboard box, and putting another box in and saying, this is what we do now. I mean, it was just boom. It was just instantly overnight. That was branded uncool, unhip, and just done. And you were made fun of if you even ever liked it. And it wasn't just a washout of, here's a big part of that gets lost. So the bands took the brunt of it, obviously, those bands. But so did anyone aligned with those bands. Meaning that if you were a producer who had just produced 6 platinum records for, name the band, Winger, and all of a sudden you go and there's a record label and you're the 80s producer. We can't work with you. You couldn't possibly understand this. Like anyone who had an affiliation, if you were a photographer, if you were a record label A&R guy, signing those bands, suddenly it was a badge. You walked around proud of the fact that you signed White Lion, who sold 3 million copies, right? Well, overnight you went from being, let me get that off my resume, because that won't make me look cool in 1993. So it was across the board with the industry. It really was. And it hit the 70s acts to some degree too. Not as badly, but it did.